Welcome to the Vortex Nation podcast, brought to you by lovers of hunting, shooting, public lands, the Second Amendment, and good food.
All right, everybody, it's November. We are, at least locally here, at the height of our archery season. The rut has officially kicked off. There's bucks moving everywhere. Pretty exciting stuff. Some people are in the office. Some people are out in the office in their tree stands as we speak.
Just back from the mountains.
Yeah, Paul's just back from the mountains. Actually, I didn't even get to hear about your hunt yet, so I'm pumped to hear about that.
No.
Don't even tell me.
Not in Wisconsin, being that you mentioned mountains.
But Erik and I actually found a dead buck the other day. We actually don't know how or why it met its demise, but it kind of prompted the topic of today's discussion, which is difficult blood trails, or blood trailing in general, maybe.
Yeah.
Definitely a lot going on there, a lot of a lot of information, good stuff to know. Man, I tell you what, I've learned something from every deer that I've trailed. But yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Like I said, we don't know how that deer died, but definitely potentially was hit and lost by a
Looks
hunter.
like there was an arrow wound in it after looking at that first photo that we got of it.
Which is pretty crazy, too, because from the location of that wound, doesn't look entirely bad.
Yep.
At all.
No,
Like it should have been a fatal
Yeah.
shot.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of tricky. Whoever that was, if that is what happened, pretty bummed dude because that was a nice buck.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So blood trails is an interesting thing to me. Where would you guys, as more experienced hunters, where would you rank that on like the tracking of the blood trail after the kill? Like, that's a topic that you don't see. It doesn't get as much of the limelight. Is that fair to say?
Probably not as exciting as some of the other stuff, but it is definitely a key thing. And
it's extremely key.
Anybody that hunts, I mean,
A lot
sooner
of
or
times-
later you are going to be following a blood trail.
When I've watched like shows or videos or things like that, or when you see photos, it's kind of like the tracking or like of the buck, like finding the deer or whatever, shooting it, and then gutting it out. But you missed that
kind
blood
of
trail.
skipping that.
They kind of skip that.
There,
But there's a lot of interesting pieces there. We've talked about some of them in the office, and we have some interesting stories here amongst all of us as well, I'd say, as far as tracking blood trails go.
Yep.
Well, I'm sure.
There's so many things that go into it, right? And I think we'll probably get there through this discussion. But what was the animal shot with? Was it a rifle?
Yep.
Was it a muzzleloader? Was it a bow?
Yep.
Because they're all going to kill in different ways. They might leave different types of blood trails.
Let me just kick it off here with a question, just because it
got?
seems like there's no awesome way to enter into this besides just dive in. So my question might be out of order, but I'm just going to ask this. Now, we were discussing a while back, like, how long to wait before starting to track a blood trail. And that conversation I found to be very interesting. It was actually kind of weird to me to hear that, because in my head, and I think to maybe another one of the more inexperienced hunters, you think like, oh, you shot that thing, like you just go after it, right?
He's laying there dead.
Yeah, like
Yep.
what are you doing? Why are you waiting around? I've seen, sometimes where people shoot it and they're like, yeah, we're going to go home, get some dinner real quick, and then we'll come back out and we'll try and pick up that blood trail. It's like, what?
Yeah.
Wait,
Go get that thing.
there's a thing right there. You just shot at it. Like, don't you? But so what's going on there? Like, why? And what determines? Do you wait a couple of minutes? Do you wait a couple of hours? Do you like?
I think
What's going on?
Mark said it best. It depends on what you use it for, or what you use to attempt the harvest. If it's a bow, common practice to after the shot wait for an hour or two or more, depending on your confidence in the shot or where it was or what you had shot before.
Do you just kind of know how your shot was?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
Part of it would be, part of that whole picture is when you shoot is really being conscious of where you think you hit that animal. Mm-hmm. That sight picture, follow up, whether it's a bow or a gun, you should, after you shoot, have a pretty good feeling how that shot went, how the shot broke, where it impacted. That's almost like the very first beginning step to all of this. And, and then like Ryan said, archery hunting, it's definitely sort of traditional to wait a period of time. You're sitting in that tree and you definitely want to track something. I mean, your instinct is to go right after it, but waiting is usually the better plan.
Well, yeah, there's so many weird things there because as we've discussed before, like Ryan, you've mentioned it, for example, antelope, right? Like you don't want to, like a lot of people give antelope a bad rap, but in some ways people think it's because, oh, well, maybe they don't get it on ice soon enough, right? Or get it in like skin it out and all that stuff, do that soon enough. So then to think about like letting something go for an hour or two, it's almost like, why are you letting it go like that?
That is a tough one. I think you'd have to look also at like the terrain and the like geographically where you're at. So
Time of year.
to the bow hunter who would take a shot and then wait, usually it's going to be because he or she doesn't have line of sight on the animal. You can't see it. So like when I hunt Western states, you know, if you take an animal and it doesn't drop at the shot, if it continues on, you can typically watch it for a good long while. And I don't know, I would like to ask the question to a Western bow hunter who hunts, say, prairie mule deer, or prairie antelope, or prairie whitetails. If you take an animal, do you wait out there or do you observe and pursue? Great question. In the woods, though, I think it's more because you don't have sight on the animal, at the shot or just immediately after the shot, that you give it time to expire.
Well, it's really the same out west too.
Yeah.
You like you said though, you may have the opportunity in open country to watch that animal at a longer distance, and hopefully you'd see it expire. But if you don't, if you're in trees or slopes or something like that, you're really in the same scenario.
Certainly.
Kind of comes back to bows killing by bleeding out rather than shock and destruction, and they just likely are going to take longer, although not necessarily.
Right.
I mean, a good double lung arrow hit is pretty lethal, pretty fast. You could very easily see an animal expire within seconds of a really good bow shot.
I mean, you definitely can, but even on a really good bow shot, I mean, I know at least for myself, if like you said, if you don't have line of sight on that animal, even if I think it's just the absolute best shot I've ever made in my life, I'm still waiting that hour.
Me too. As soon as you've lost sight of the animal, it's probably time to plan and sit there for a little bit.
Is that hard?
Yes.
Oh, very
yes.
tough.
Okay.
Yeah, especially on a big animal. You're like, every instinct you want to go chase right after that thing.
It's the excitement of the animal that you've just taken. You just took a trophy animal, or however you scale trophy, but it's the anticipation of, did I put an ethical shot on it? Now what's happening? So that's kind of the doozy for me anyway. But and another thing with waiting too, especially when you have, like Paul was talking about, how archery equipment kills, quite literally, is different than a rifle. And if we really boil it down, it's all technically asphyxiation, I guess, because we're starving the brain of oxygen. But it's just different with a bow. A friend of mine had hit a whitetail, what we thought was really good. We didn't have any video footage of it, but at the impact site, recovered the arrow. The arrow had the, quote, right kind of blood on it. We found the right kind of hair all around, and there was buckets of blood at the site. I mean, it was like, well, that thing is going to be 10 yards from here. But he immediately got out of his stand. Like, he shot it, he watched it, it disappeared over a knoll maybe 20 yards in front of him, and he, jumped out of his stand to go find this. He ended up bumping it very shortly after he had seen it disappear, and he got out of his stand. Off it took, and we tracked that thing till the next morning. And by all rights, it should have been dead. So pushing an animal before it's ready to expire, depending on the shot, can kind of supercharge them with an adrenaline boost.
It absolutely does. Yeah.
That defies physiology and biology on how something should have expired due to the condition that it's in, and it took off. We never did find that deer.
So when you let them go there for a while, the hope is that they'll just kind of make their way to what are you hoping for?
They bed.
Yeah, if they don't see something coming after them immediately. You think about from that animal's perspective, he knows something hit him. He doesn't really know what. Something poked him, jabbed him, shocked him, and they immediately run. But if they don't sense immediately that something's coming after them, a lot of times, if they're wounded and they're feeling bad and they don't have a sense of something coming right behind them, they're going to lay up fairly quickly. And that's the goal with all of this, is to let that animal lay up and then hopefully bleed out without going into the mode that Ryan was talking about, where they kind of get that supercharge of adrenaline, and all of a sudden they can run another 5 miles just on on that.
Well, not only can they run quite a distance, but if they have laid down, those wounds can clot, they can clog a little bit, I should say, like kind of the entrance and exits where you might be getting a blood trail, all of a sudden, you don't have that trail to follow, or, more limited.
the clotting thing is a really good point, because I had a situation very similar to what your buddy had, only it was a terrible I mean, it was only an inch off on my part, but I shot at a deer with my bow, hit him right in the leg bone, forms that joint right in the shoulder.
Oh, yeah.
Completely broke the deer's leg. And that was a case where I wanted to get on that deer right away, because I knew that deer instantly went from 4 legs to 3 legs, and now I want to keep him bleeding. So I don't want him to lay down, and I don't want that to clot up. So that was a deal where we tracked the deer all night and just kept bumping him. You know, he'd bed down, we'd bump him up again. And we kept doing this series of that until the next day he was totally exhausted. We found him in a CRP field, and I was able to sneak up and get another arrow in him. There's another total long story after that shot, but that deer ended up going just under 2.5 miles from point of impact to recovery. Jeez. And a lot of that was because we were staying on him. I mean, pitch black, following up, we would know where he'd be bedded, and we'd bump him up again. And it was.
Did you, in the process of that, did you have an idea where that hit? Where what was going on with the hit? Yeah. So that's,
it was a unique situation where, we always talk about, like, sometimes a bad shot, even if it's 20 inches off, could be in the femoral artery. You're 2 feet off from where your point of aim is, but you kill that deer immediately or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But in this situation, I was 3 inches, maybe not even, 1.5 inches off, and put the arrow in the deer's shoulder, breaking its leg, but not harming any vital organs. Now we're talking about a deer that probably isn't going to die because of that shot, but then that's why we're trying to keep him on his feet.
Right.
What kind of blood were you getting off that wound? Like, what were you guys finding? While you were keeping him moving.
Yeah. Earlier, Ryan said the right kind of blood, which I highlighted because I thought that was an interesting thing to say.
Yep.
Well, going off like right kind of blood, I think all you guys would agree. The ideal shot is going to be a double lung or a heart shot, and you're going to be seeing bubbles in that blood.
Nice, bright, foamy-looking blood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Bubbles, is that just because it's near the oxygen factory, essentially?
Coming through the lungs, getting air mixed in with it.
Yep. So this was, in this case, the leg shot deer was a very bright red, like muscle kind of blood. So like if if you've ever cut your finger or whatever, you might have just a really bright red kind of blood. That's essentially what we were finding on this. And that was our primary source, our visual aid in finding that deer, was keeping him bleeding. So we didn't want him to lay down and let that wound clog up. So we just wanted to keep him going. All that blood was obviously running down its leg, which is now dragging. So its motor skills are impacted at this point. So now a leg that would traditionally be maneuvering through brush is now just being dragged. So we were able to find where that leg was dragging along through stuff, and we were able to find, where it was honestly one of the easier blood. It was a walk-along blood trail, even given the arrow only went in about 1.5 inches, because it stopped immediately as soon as it impacted bone.
Wow,
that's interesting.
That is interesting.
Kudos to you on the recovery, because I know
say that's not an easy trail.
Yeah, a lot of people wouldn't be adamant, or they'd look at that if you had recovered the arrow, the shaft, and the broadhead at first, and thought, that was non-fair.
Yeah, it was. I guess kudos on that part, but then it ended up taking a terrible turn the next day when I did get that second arrow in him. All I could see was the top of his rack. Wasn't able to get in as close as I would have liked because he was still fairly alert, in his bed. All I could see was the tips of his tines. So I glassed him, found his throat patch, and just held just under his throat patch, let the arrow go, hit right where I was aiming. The deer got up out of its bed, and that was the last I saw it for another week.
Oh, no.
And we looked for him for 2.5 days. I mean, we covered ground like you wouldn't believe, and mentally exhausting and physically exhausting. It got to the point where it's impacting my work and stuff, so I had to go back to work at some point. And lo and behold, I got luckier than probably any, deer hunter I know has ever gotten in terms of luck. A local fishing guy found the deer on the bank of this lake that I was hunting nearby, and somehow was able to find me through social media and told me that he found my deer.
That's crazy.
It was incredible.
Huh.
So it was a sinking feeling knowing that the deer was dead out there, and we had essentially given up. So like that's why it was kudos that first night, but then internally it's almost a deer that I'm not proud of, because at the end of it I had to give up at some point. But to give up and know that you have a dead animal out there is probably the worst feeling as a hunter.
It's tough. Yeah, I think we've all been there. I mean, if you hunt, that's
you
strive to avoid that, but it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're not out there just to kill something.
Yeah, absolutely not.
It's way more than that.
Yep, absolutely.
In fact, if you do just go out there and just kill something and you don't retrieve it, that is like
Wanton
terrible.
waste, yeah.
Horrible.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not only not the right thing to do, it's illegal.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing that Ryan mentioned earlier as well was the right kind of hair. So I can only imagine that when you say the right kind of hair, you're just talking about like that's the hair. When you look at a deer, it's a bunch of brown hair, right, with an occasional patch of maybe some white or something like that. But like, what kind of hair are you looking for?
It's going to be species specific too. So
Okay.
sometimes that statement works and sometimes it doesn't. But if you look at the vital region of a whitetail, going up the side of its ribs or whatever, it's going to have that very stereotypical hair that you're talking about, that medium weight brown coat. Towards the belly, you're getting white hair, and then towards the armpit area, which is typically just a little bit above that, especially for an archer, kind of the hot spot, you get a longer wispy hair. It looks almost like it's a whisker of the armpit, and that white hair and that side hair. Leg hair is very short. It's generally a different color. So you don't want that. You don't want to see an excessive amount of white hair because that typically means a low shot.
Right. On deer.
It takes a lot, and I think a lot of tracking in general, and not tracking in the term like we head out into the woods to find a game animal, but tracking after the shot takes an understanding of the quarry that you're chasing, and then a little bit of anatomy and physiology, a little bit of ballistics, and a little bit of, I don't know what you'll call it, terrain science, or trying to understand how an animal will manipulate terrain for its benefit if it's wounded. And so the right kind of hair, the right kind of blood, that's a big thing. That's a real thing. So pay attention to how your critter is built and where you're going to find that kind of hair, and it'll help you create a map of what happened at the shot, the point where you couldn't see it.
Yeah, I think another thing, is right after the shot, understanding, being able to read an animal's body language.
Oh yeah.
If you do have, like we talked about liver, just in our discussions about why you would wait versus, head up the blood trail right away. Traditionally, if you have like a liver or a gut shot deer, or any game animal for that matter, as soon as it's shot in that area, it gets sick to its stomach, kind of hunches up, just looks.
Tucks its tail.
Yep.
Huh.
And it might kind of slink off slowly. Whereas like something that's absolutely 10-ringed, shot, in the lung or heart, that thing's just boom out of there like a bat out of heck, So
Okay.
understanding that body language, I think, goes a long way for guys too.
That's an interesting way to describe it, but it is. If you haven't seen it, then maybe it's a little bit more difficult. But they do, like, if you hit a deer a little far back, and I guess I'm probably talking a little bit more, bow hunting right now.
Yeah.
But they will go, and if you are able to watch them stop, they slow down. They might hunch up a little bit, and then they just like walk off. Like you said, just kind of sick looking, and just slowly walk off. And again, I mean, maybe beating a dead horse here, or just reiterating something. I mean, that's definitely a sign to say, look, I got to wait a while here. Probably a fatal hit.
Yep.
But, and wait a while, and like we talked about, even back out for a number of hours and try to back out slowly and not make a lot of noise, because even that can, if that deer is bedded close nearby, you definitely don't want to get them up, because you might have a really good chance to find them if you don't bump that deer. In fact, I had that happen to me a couple years ago. I made, not a great shot on a deer, and, case in point, listen to your own advice, right? And I knew better, but I hit a buck a little far back. I was following some blood, and I really actually hadn't gone that far. I thought I was totally in a safe zone. Like I was actually planning on backing out, but I just wanted a little.
Couldn't resist one peek. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted a little bit more information,
Yep.
and I probably only went, 50, 60 yards in a very open landscape, but he had bedded actually just right on the edge where it started to get thick, and I got that deer up, and I ended up not finding it.
Yeah. A little plug for the optics. A lot of time when I'm bow hunting and that situation hits, one of the things you can do anyway while you're sitting there initially is you can use your binoculars, and of course when you make a shot, bow or gun, you're really striving to see where you hit. And then the next thing you're trying to do is you're trying to pay really good attention to following that animal with your eyes absolutely as far as you can till the very last instant, and then very carefully mentally marking that spot. I mean, really closely as best you can, exactly where you last saw a sight of that animal. But then the next thing I'll do, if it's bow hunting, for example, and you're sitting there with a bow and you're going to wait, is I'll take my binos out and, you're looking just like Mark trying to initially track a little bit. You're looking carefully, and you can if you get a really good blood trail, double lung hit, and they're shooting blood out all over the place. A lot of times you can see that with your binos. And then if it's an arrow, I'm usually trying to spot that knock and see if I can see the knock sitting around there anywhere in the dirt for a pass through shot. But it's something you can do, anyway. You're not going to spook them then. You've got a few minutes to kind of look around and mark stuff. And
Well, yeah, and that's actually, I'd done all that with that deer. Initially I thought the shot was a lot better than it turned out to be, and I was glassing for my arrow and I couldn't find it, and I was glassing for the blood trail and I couldn't find it, which was making me a little. And actually, the indicator was, though, I saw that deer hunch a little bit, tuck his tail, and walk off slowly. I'm like, what he's doing isn't matching what I kind of had mentally of what had taken place there, and so I did. I think I waited, a minimum of an hour, possibly even an hour and a half, and then I got down and I found the arrow, and we can get into that too, but I was like, then I really knew that the shot wasn't what I thought it was.
Yeah.
right.
And again, listen to your own advice, but I really hadn't gone very far at all, and that deer had bedded really, really close by.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when you have potentially, low shot or gut shot or something like that, well, one, hopefully you saw the shot hit. Two, you start picking up on some cues. Three, does the blood, I can only imagine, look different? Probably is it darker when you hit maybe like a...
You'll find stomach matter sometimes if you do have
that's,
that.
And of course, that's the thing you sort of least want to see is that gut material and stomach material, or you find an arrow and you can see it's got the
smell it.
gut residue on it, or you smell it.
Yep.
Right?
Okay.
Then
that
you
like
know it's a definite
raunchy
weight.
smell?
Oh yeah.
It'll smell like anyone who's field dressed an animal and poked the stomach or poked the entrails and has that instant whiff of that body fluid. That's what you would be smelling on an arrow, or if you find, say it's a gunshot and you find that on a leaf, you smell the leaf. So
And that's generally going to be one where you're going to wait longer too. That's what you guys are saying, right? Yeah.
It's inevitably fatal. Like it's going to kill the animal.
Yeah.
I don't think you could. I'd be curious to see if anybody's ever gut shot a critter. It actually hit the stomach or hit small intestine, and it didn't kill the animal. It's just going to take time, and that is the hard part about it. But sometimes they don't bleed very well either.
yeah,
Right.
There's a remarkably low amount of blood that can come out of those
Externally.
Yeah.
You got to
Yeah.
know that if something gets hit like that. It's probably bleeding a lot internally, but...
Yep.
And Jim, to jump back to your question about wanting to recover animals as quickly as possible and not having a wounded animal or dead animal laying out there for a long period of time before you're able to, to dress them and take care of them. The thing with a gut shot, though, that happens is you make that shot and that animal goes and lays up. It's not as though it died there and then you're waiting 2 hours to come and track it. It's alive most of that time. If you could time it ideally, you'd get to the animal about the same time that it expired. But it's not, you could wait many hours and that animal is still alive. It's not, you're really not in danger at that point of losing meat.
So the key is that blood is still flowing through its tissue.
It's circulating through the body, right? It's not, the meat isn't going bad while the animal is sitting there wounded. It's not, it's probably not doing wonders for the quality of the meat that you're going to get.
Yeah, I was going to say, now one thing that could potentially is if you do start bumping it, and that adrenaline rush, doesn't that have potentially an effect on the...
Yeah, it does. And that's, in that scenario where an animal's gut shot, and like Ryan said, it is going to die. There's just no doubt about it. But the difference is if you begin to follow that animal and you supercharge it with adrenaline and now know something is after it, then that animal can run for miles yet, even though he's mortally wounded.
Mm-hmm.
And that crud is going to get all in its tissue and things like that, right? The adrenaline. That stuff doesn't taste good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it can make that gamey flavor.
Certainly.
Well, then, there, correct me if I'm wrong, but, a deer that's shot in that location is dying almost because they, septic.
Yes.
Like, we're talking about the blood. There isn't in that region, you hit the heart, it's going to bleed a lot internally and externally. You hit the lungs, it's going to bleed a lot internally and externally, but there's less going on right there. So, yeah, that does make, we're talking about difficult blood trails.
Those are the toughest,
and then, what do you do then, too? So let's say you get something like that and you got to wait a while Now, the one thing when you guys found that buck that another hunter had shot and obviously didn't recover is obviously coyotes got to it.
Yep.
Is there anything that you can do to prevent that from happening? Or, I mean, it's like asking if there's anything you could do to prevent nature from happening, you know?
Right.
So
It's luck of the draw.
fingers crossed, right?
And
Is
you're
that-
usually talking of, for something like predators to find an animal, it usually takes a while.
Takes a
I mean,
longer
that's
time.
usually a longer stretch than what, even if you're waiting a period of time to begin blood trailing,
Okay.
most of the time it's going to take predators, a day or so to get on something.
Okay. Gotcha.
And that can depend regionally too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
Yep.
could, there are areas where you might hunt in grizzly country, and there might be
Yeah.
a grizzly on it much faster than that. So
My hunting partner shot a whitetail 2 years ago, just after opening light, dropped it where it stood, and it was kind of behind some brush. He had another tag, and in the time it took him to kind of settle his things and look around for a doe and then decide, you know what, I'm just going to go get it out, the coyotes had moved on it, unbeknownst to him, and consumed a large portion of it. And we're talking about 20 minutes,
And how far away was that?
like 135 yards. It was just bizarre.
yeah, that's
Dude, those things are
that's an
stealthy.
anomaly.
Yeah.
That's definitely an
Those things are
interesting-
stealthy, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never heard of something happening that fast. And like you said, it is a gamble. It could depend
Yeah.
on the region or just whatever. A buddy of mine in Nebraska, though, his boy shot a deer in the evening, and they went back the next morning, and he sent me a picture of it, and it was basically a skeleton. I'd never seen anything like. I mean, it was like you would have thought it'd been picked clean over months,
Right.
And then other times you can leave them overnight without incident. It's a nice cool day. You go recover it and butcher it, and everything's good to go. So
We talked a lot about liver shots and gut shots. I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts on like single lung hits, because I think that's a liver shot and a gut shot. You have a dead animal every time, albeit it's probably going to take 8 hours, full day, whatever it is. But a single lung hit, that's not a bad shot. But I think that's something that I've personally have seen a deer live for months after a single lung hit. And, I just would be curious to see if
It wouldn't surprise me if they can, and that's something in my early days of bow hunting. I used to sit way up high in trees, way high, probably too high, higher than I should have been. And so I had a number of shots that went down at very steep angles through deer, and I'm sure were single lung hits and animals that ultimately I did not recover.
Yep.
That initially left a great blood trail. The blood looked right. It was nice, foamy, bright colored blood, lots of it, and then very quickly peters out though. And then that animal covers a lot of ground. And, so yeah, I think that does happen. And it wouldn't surprise me if they do occasionally survive that.
well, Paul,
They can definitely cut, for what happens on them is it looks like a really good, lethal, vital hit. But if they, if it's only through one lung, they can go and go and go. And
Yeah,
go,
yeah.
especially if you see what looks like a good blood trail and you think you're on and you start trailing it and you bump them and then they're gone.
Yep. And Paul, you touched on something that I think is really important. Is you're talking about being high in the tree and that steep angle. And I thought maybe for some of the folks out there who may have not be super familiar, like what might cause a single lung hit.
Yeah.
You got that steep angle.
Yeah, that's
where that.
Yeah, or even it could be just you're at a more typical height, but it's an instance where that deer is coming right under the tree and you're just taking a sharp down and and then you just catch one.
Yeah. Or those quartering away angles.
Yeah.
Even if you are at a good height, that can be all it takes to punch one lung and not the other. I mean, the situation that I mentioned when I kind of brought this up is a couple of years ago, I had a neighbor who shot a buck at a 1/4-2 angle and hit one lung. I mean, instantly there was great blood right away. And I mean, he even waited a couple hours before he picked up the trail. He went in, started tracking it, jumped the deer after, maybe 200 yards of following the blood trail. And, this was a whitetail in an area where I had cameras out. My neighbor had cameras out. I had a bunch of pictures of this deer, as did he. Long story short, he wasn't able to recover it within like 3 days or whatever. And then he asked me if I had checked any of my cameras. So I did, and I still had pictures of the deer. Fast forward another month, And this was right around Thanksgiving. He shot the deer November 3rd or something like that. So fast forward a few more weeks, he asked me if I was going to be around over the Thanksgiving holiday. I told him I wasn't. He said, do you mind if I go check the property that you hunt to see if that deer's dead in a ditch? And I said, yeah, by all means. First, let me just go check my cameras. And I went in to go check my trail cameras that day. And sure enough, that deer was still alive, moving around, in daylight. Fast forward another month and a half, I killed that deer with a gun in the muzzleloader season, and when I field dressed it, its right lung, so the side that he shot it on, was like, it looked like smoker's lung, like when you see those diagrams on TV or whatever. This thing was shriveled up like a raisin. It just looked dead. The other lung was looked totally normal, and
that's very interesting.
I've I'm sure we can post them in the show notes. I have a trail camera photo of that deer standing in front of my camera with the arrow wound front and center in the frame. And if you'd look at that shot, you'd be like, how is that deer standing there? And
Crazy.
it's unreal.
That's fascinating to me.
It's an interesting story.
I've definitely heard of deer and elk getting hit in one lung and surviving, or, I've heard of guys even recovering like broadheads,
I've
that
cut up
encased lung.
many elk and found embedded broadheads
Right.
many times. Actually, it's almost to the point of, if we killed a good bull out in Idaho where I guided at, the odds were fairly high that you were going to recover a broadhead in them. Yeah, it was amazing.
Wow.
But many times I should say that wasn't necessarily in a vital zone. That might be in a muscle, in a shoulder, in a hindquarter.
Yeah.
Where what you're talking about is right through a lung and collapsing a lung. That's kind of interesting.
Well, and not only that, but just like the angle that you describe it, it's like, okay, yeah, I got one lung. It was a quartering 2 shot. I can obviously buy that. That's what happened, right? But then the arrow oftentimes isn't stopping there, or maybe it did stop there. I would have assumed that you got, guts and possibly even liver, which, that's for sure.
That deer, yeah. No, it was an incredible situation.
Did you examine any of the other organs at all?
Yeah, everything was covered. So I processed, the deer myself. And when I, removed the hide and everything, his fat had turned into like a yellow mustard brown kind of color. Yep. He had no fat on him, as like on his, whereas you would shoot a deer, you'd expect it to be covered in this wall of fat. He had nothing on him. The little bit he did have was kind of covered in this mustard goo looking stuff. And, his other lung looked entirely normal. But that arrow, basically what it had done is it had entered, I don't know if it stopped on the opposite shoulder, because it was a far forward shot. It wasn't, far back, whereas if it would have been back, it probably would have got more of the opposite lung and resulted in a dead deer. This was kind of where it just went forward, clipped probably that offside lung that he was shooting at. Arrow stopped, or in this case, it stopped in him, broke off, and then months later, it ended up passing through on the opposite side. It was a totally wild scenario.
Wow.
Okay, gotcha.
What's going on there? You think, Ryan? You were saying about the yellowy, mustardy looking stuff.
Yeah.
What do you think that is? Is it like an infection or?
Partially, yeah. And then it's the animal also processing what it has for reserves.
Right. That animal wasn't going to make it through the winter.
Correct.
Oh, so it's essentially feeding on its own fat.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So
to nutriize, nutriize itself.
that's the scientific term. Yeah. I can't even say it. Nutriize. Yeah.
I think it's
My
also a varmint
Sort of what
in Florida.
happens, as deer go through a winter, though. That's, when they get into the middle of the winter and there's really not much food, and they sort of go through wintertime for wild animals is really just a long period of slow starvation. And they hope that their fat reserves carry them through until there's food supply again in the spring. So that buck was obviously sort of going through an early withdrawal of all his reserves.
And you think the yellowy stuff was kind of like an infection or something?
It could be. It could also be if the animal's depositing like a toxicity or some sort of toxin in its adipose tissue as like a way to flush it out. I don't know. I'd have to look into that a little bit. That is a little bizarre that it would turn from that kind of classic white cake marble look to that yellow. It could just be that that's red blood cells redepositing.
Yeah.
Well, it might, it might well be. I don't know. I haven't done it, but if you had the opportunity to cut up a deer, say in March or April,
what it would look like.
They might very well all look like that.
That's a good
Possibly,
question.
that's just sort of a remains of the fat reserves being taken down
Yeah.
to low levels.
That's a good point too. I mean, adipose tissue is always exemplified as yellow. So you think about fat, you always think about like yellow. So maybe it's like as it shrinks down and diminishes, that's just what you're left with.
How was the meat on it?
I mean, the meat was fine. It was so the meat that we didn't have in a brine or didn't marinate, it was a little gamey, and I'm sure a lot of that was because of we talked about testosterone flowing through these, or not adrenaline, and obviously this deer experienced that once for a very long period of time, and then went through the rut. And was trying to, to your point, probably doing a slow starvation. And that's why the deer was exhibiting so much daylight activity. It was feeding heavily. It was like one of the first deer out. It was a big mature buck, one of the first deer that would come out in these fields to feed.
I'm sure. I guess I would assume, kind of like we're talking about here, that, his body was burning a fair amount of energy trying to fight off essentially what had happened to him,
Yeah. Now, you guys mentioned earlier at some point too, and this is all very interesting because I'm not really not much of a bow hunter. I would like to try it eventually and get into it. But so you find an arrow. So I've heard that a couple of times. Now you shoot an arrow at a deer, and hopefully you stick it. But then later on you find it, so it's essentially just fallen out
Or passes through.
or passes through. Okay. So what does that indicate? I guess does it like if you find your arrow, are you kind of like, oh, my game plan has changed?
It could.
Or
definitely.
if you don't find an arrow, then is there one that's more ideal than the other? Or
I mean, the first thing, like typically you'd be pretty happy about seeing a pass-through shot. Usually, seeing that arrow there. Like I was telling you, sitting in a tree stand, kind of scanning around and looking. And if I felt the shot was good and I know there was a hit and the deer runs off and I can see the fletch of the arrow over there, I'm feeling pretty good about that shot generally. Now, it doesn't until you get up there and you check that arrow, though, you don't really know. You could get a pass-through shot that went right through both lungs and that deer's going to be dead, in 100 yards. But it could also equally be a pass-through in the guts. And then we're back to what we're talking about here. But that's where the first thing you do is, as any bow hunter is going to do, is you go up and you look at that arrow. And you're smelling it, as we talked about. You're looking at the color of the blood on the arrow. You're looking at the color of the hair that's along there. All that stuff. They're all giving you clues about where that hit actually went through. But generally, most often, if you felt the shot was good and it broke nice and everything and a pass through, I mean, you're feeling pretty good. You're feeling that you probably got a double lung hit on that animal, and it's going to be dead quickly.
You talked about arrows breaking off, and I think that's super interesting because sometimes you'll find an arrow that's broke off that might be broken off right at where the broadhead meets the shaft of the arrow. That, to me, means that arrow impacted a very significant bone immediately as soon as it hit the animal. Now, on the other hand, you might find an arrow that penetrated, a foot or whatever, and maybe it has 8 to 12 inches broken off inside that deer. To me, right away, I'm thinking that arrow went in, impacted a lot of, hopefully vital organs, maybe penetrated and stuck in that opposite side shoulder. Now, as soon as that deer retracted its legs to start running away from the shot, snaps the arrow right there, backside falls out, and then ideally that broadhead is still in that animal doing damage every time it.
It is, for anybody who's...
I was just thinking, I'm kind of a...
For anybody who's listening to this and they're thinking like, wow, this is a morbid topic. It kind of is, absolutely, but this is 100% and totally, completely vital to the success of a sportsman or woman. Like this is the inevitability. You have to consider these things before taking a shot.
If you think it's morbid and then you go to the restaurant and eat a burger, then
correct.
You just got to
And
get
we probably
frame
we're
of
painting, like Ryan said, maybe a little bit of a grim picture about bow hunting here, but it should also be fairly said if you have a good hit with an arrow and you do get that double lung shot, it's actually phenomenal how quickly and humanely that will put an animal down. It's unbelievable. I mean, I've watched 700-pound bull elk shot at close range, double lunged with an arrow, and be dead within seconds. I mean, it's just amazing. It's phenomenally, and even more so, a lot of times the nature of that hit and the way it works, being a sharp bladed instrument, is I think a lot of times they don't even realize that they've been hit by something.
No.
Yeah.
So it's not that every archery kill is going to be this long, drawn out process of. But
you talk about kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Like this is the ugly.
When,
But it's part of it.
When
This is
on
part
the
of it.
topic of blood trails, is
Yep.
typically it's where this comes from.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so we talked about single lung hits. I actually started kind of what propelled me into rifle reloading for purpose was a single lung hit resultant from an inappropriate bullet choice used on a whitetail when I was younger. I decided I was going to use a light caliber cartridge with a bullet that was not well designed for shooting whitetails. Marketed as explosive results. And at the time I was reading a lot of magazines where companies said you want to deposit all this energy in this deer, which I now believe is a total farce. I shot the animal on the shoulder. The bullet exploded effectively, and I saw what is, and to this day, still the only example of what they have called a flap injury, where you have a crater that occurs just under the dermal layer and the skin pops up. A small piece of jacket passed through the thinnest part of the shoulder blade, the scapula bone, and nicked the lung, deflating it. I found that deer the next day. And that was it for me. It was like, okay, I'm switching to
Yeah.
Bill.
I
man.
had a very similar. I shot a bull elk once that I think had exactly that same type of injury. It probably wasn't the best choice of bullet. Obvious impact, initial blood trail, and then we followed that bull for 2 days and never recovered him. He eventually got into a big bedding area with many dozens of other elk tracks, and the ability to track him was gone, and we lost him. But I think that's exactly what we ran into on that one.
When you shoot one with a rifle, generally speaking, well, one, now I'm curious too on your thoughts on, bullet choice and all that stuff. But two, do you get a similar blood trail when you shoot it with a rifle?
I would say it depends on how you place your shots. And so
I mean, sometimes with a rifle, you just see it and they just drop right
a
there,
lot of
right?
times with the rifle, I don't get a blood trail. Like depending on how the animal is hit and where it's hit and where that initial impact site was, I can recall a dozen different deer that I've taken an antelope over the years where I don't have exterior blood. It doesn't bleed. It's sometimes
a lot of times with a gun, I think you recover them many times before you get into the blood trailing part of it, unless it is just a bad hit.
Yep.
And then, but yeah, a lot of times it takes longer to initially begin to pick up that blood trail with the rifle. I've seen that too.
With archery equipment, and to credit the way an arrow kills, from the moment that it contacts the animal, it is opening it up.
Yeah.
And it's usually cutting on at least two faces. And so like a lot of state regulations you'll read, they'll say must have two cutting surfaces, must have a cutting diameter of X. And a lot of these broadheads nowadays, if they're a fixed broadhead, they're either a huge bladed double bevel or, they're four blades, and you're creating a pretty traumatic wound channel. And that's why Paul had mentioned earlier, they expire so quickly because it's a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about it's a lot of trauma, and a lot of times it's not really noticed by the animal. I shot a doe whitetail one time that I thought I missed her. She kind of jumped at the shot, tail went up. She was doing the head fake, tip, down. I mean, she made 4 steps from the time I shot to the time she expired. And it was just kind of a perfect scenario. But with the rifle, if you were to shoot an animal in the lung area or in the heart area, you're going to get the same blood. You're going to see that kind of thing. But
in that case, you're relying on a bullet which is smaller than a broadhead. You're relying on it expanding.
correct.
Right?
Yep.
And shock.
Yeah,
And
and
shock,
shock,
just simply the velocity and the impact of that bullet hitting at high speed.
It's going to mess stuff up too.
Shock and
does.
trauma.
Yeah.
I mean, you might hit the lungs, or if you hit a shoulder, all that. I know Brian was just talking about energy, but I mean, a lot of that energy is transferred into the animal, and you might have hit the lungs, but you shocked the spine. You might not have to trail that animal
Yeah.
at all.
Correct.
Interesting.
Or, you might hit a shoulder blade,
Yep.
which, is essentially connected to the spine-ish,
Yep.
and you're sending, bullet and bone fragment up in there and, severing that connection, and,
Yep.
and down they go.
I thought it was interesting how you talked about how you usually don't get much of a blood trail with a rifle, and I've seen that a lot with my muzzleloader hunts. I shot a deer a couple of years ago that he was quartering away. The bullet, I come to find out, stopped in the offside shoulder, so I didn't have a pass through
Right.
with a bullet, and basically I was dealing with just a 50 millimeter diameter hole
Pretty
on the
small entry wound,
on one side. So I had nothing, and I thought I missed, even though I was filming my hunts at the time, and I kept watching it back, and I knew I impacted the deer. Kept following his tracks in the snow. he went down a hill, and then he didn't actually start bleeding until he started going up that other side, and he was really digging to come up hard.
Yeah.
And then you could tell blood was coming out of his mouth and off that entry wound, and he was dead at the top of the hill. You know?
Man, that's such a very important thing to bring up, too, is just depending on where the wound is, the type of wound, and the terrain. I mean, like you said, that deer wasn't bleeding until he started to go uphill, did you say?
Yep, uphill.
Yeah. No, I had a similar thing with a muzzleloader. The biggest whitetail I ever killed, I shot him at 32 yards and double lunged at the shot. I thought impossible to have missed at this close a distance, and the way the animal reacted. And I did give it a little bit of time. I thought, okay, we're just going to wait, see what happens. I got up, I walked, I scoured the ground with snow in front of me. I found no blood. And I, for about 2 hours, thought how, from like a mathematical or how did this happen? How did I even miss at this distance the way that everything was set up? And I just kind of started making bigger and bigger circles. And about 70 yards from where I last saw the animal, I saw flecks of blood in the snow. And just before the sun had come up enough to melt it. And I noticed that they were on both sides of the track. And I indicated, okay, I've got to pass through. And they were considerably they were a distance from where that animal's path was. So then I thought, okay, it's got to be a lung, just the way that this kind of thing works. It's literally spraying out. I followed it up, and 193 yards on my Onyx tracker app, I found that deer piled up, empty, completely devoid of blood.
Yeah.
He finally bled out. And at the last 20 or 30 yards, he'd really started to give it up. It was slightly high and slightly back, but by all indications, like when I had dressed him and actually held his lungs in my hands, the slug, it cut a 1/2-inch hole completely through the center of the lungs.
Crazy.
Should have been toast, but yeah, it's a doozy. Be patient with blood trails and low velocity projectiles.
Yep.
Because that's a thing. Mark and I ran into that in Missouri last year with a deer that inevitably I lost, and it's a real thing. So,
Well, and that was a crazy story too, because initially, I'm not sure I've ever seen a deer look hit harder.
Yeah.
That deer dropped at the shot, kicking. I think, later we kind of ascertained at least what we think happened. What was it, neg 25 wind chill that night? And we actually jumped that deer the next day following very, very, very little watery blood.
If I were a deer, even if I wasn't shot, I think I just want to die.
If it was that cold, absolutely.
Oftentimes, you want to be like, or you hear like, oh no, that deer is going to live. I have a hard time actually believing that deer died. If it could make considering the blood that we found. I think it was a case where we hit some muscle, shocked the spine. Initially, the animal, dropped upon impact. We followed that deer for probably via tracks and blood 2 miles.
Yeah.
At least.
Yep.
You couldn't fill a shot glass with how much that deer bled.
correct. Thankfully, we had
Half
snow.
a shot glass.
What was really interesting, like Mark said at the shot, he folded. Like it was like, well, that worked out. And we actually sat on the field because we had another tag to fill. And thought, perfect, this is great. No reason to cause alarm. We'll go out, tag the animal and all this. And we got to the kill site, and you could see where he'd fallen, and you could see where there was blood, not as much as I would have necessarily anticipated. But then again, I thought, well, it was an immediate expiration of the animal. He's going to stop pumping. And so you're not going to see a bunch of blood. And after we had gotten about 20 or 30 yards of tracking down, it was obvious he was bleeding from up high, just the way that the blood was like even hitting the snow and interacting with the brush and the trees, and only from one side. And so that kind of began to solidify our suspicions as to where it was hit. So we talked about earlier kind of an understanding of anatomy and physiology when you are trailing and looking at where your blood is on foliage, on branches, on cattails or whatever you're at, and how that blood is on the ground. If it's from a height and it's not a great hit, you're going to see little drops, right? So the blood is falling long enough that it's not being this big, large glob. It's forming into a droplet and then hitting the ground. And that's exactly what we saw. It looked like you were walking along with a water bottle at head height. Drip, 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 drip.
Yeah.
And I was shocked the next day to have bumped that animal after 12 hours of negative 25 plus a bullet wound. And on he went. So,
yeah.
That's one of those things that when that does happen, you want to think, oh, maybe he made it. Dude, have to think that deer made it.
That was
Yeah.
something. That was something.
I just don't. I mean, heck, I couldn't have lived through that night in a sleeping bag. Probably.
Yeah.
Sure.
All right, I gotta ask one that's switching gears a little bit, but we were talking about this podcast beforehand a little bit in relation to hunting public video that we just seen, actually from Wisconsin, right?
Iowa.
Oh, Iowa. Okay,
Yep.
all right, but where they had arrowed a deer, and they went back to track it, and ended up finding it, and found that it had not expired yet, but it was after legal shooting light
Yep.
or hours.
Yep.
However you
It was
say that.
at night when they found it.
At night. Now, that's tough.
Mhm.
That's a weird one because it's right there, and I mean, it wasn't like they weren't bumping it at that point. I mean,
No.
it was in rough shape
Yep.
on the ground, but they knew it was still alive. It hadn't expired yet. Like, that's a tough situation
Mhm.
because legally, there's nothing you can do about it. But like,
Yeah.
you want to do something.
Yeah.
about it.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't even know. Like, I don't even know if that's a point of discussion to bring up. Like, what are your guys' thoughts? Because it's sort of like whatever we say. It's just
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, if you,
it
I mean,
is
if
what
you had
it
a
is, right?
chance,
It's
you
the
could
rules.
probably call a game warden and get
Yeah.
permission to dispatch it or let them know what was going on. And most often, I think they would work with you to
Yeah.
humanely take care of that animal
Correct.
as quickly as possible.
Yeah, but that is a doozy. I don't know a lot of hunters that are very fond of killing things.
Nope.
And myself included, the last thing I want is an animal that is in a situation other than living or in my freezer. And that that in between ground is really difficult for me.
Yep.
And Mark knows he's seen me crawling through the snow at 27 below, looking at little pinpricks of blood, swearing loudly in the woods. But that's a tough one. That's I know what I would do, and that's that.
Yeah. It's one of those things, I mean, to your point that hunters don't like to kill. That couldn't be more true. And it's an emotional thing, taking the life of an animal.
Yeah.
And, to Jake's credit, in that video, I mean, that's a tough situation to be there and see that up close and document that. But
that's the other thing too, is that they are documenting that.
Yeah.
And I think we saw in that video, there's some people who are like, turn the camera off and you know what.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there is that. They're
Mhm.
showing, though, at the same time, a very real aspect of hunting.
Yep.
And, then there's the aspect of like, oh, well, why are you bringing video cameras out there anyway? And
Mhm.
it's also hard to deny the fact that those guys have probably introduced tons of people
Mhm.
to hunting. So, just by way of what they're doing on YouTube and things like that. So you've got,
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing because, all of what we're talking about right now isn't what you want someone to ever go through. But the fact of it is, we're sitting here with people who've been hunting for collectively, a lot of hunting experience around the stable today, and everyone here has experienced this at least once.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that's likely going to happen. And the fact of the matter is that hunting is you're taking the life of an animal, and that's not the end goal in that, but it's something that is part of it, and I think needs to be handled correctly and with respect, to that animal. So,
And I can understand the position of the state on the, I guess, the practice, right? You can't
It's the position they have to
correct.
take.
And it's not that I'm going to sit and argue till I'm blue in the face, like, oh, how could you inhibit that? It's to
for
prevent
risk of loopholes.
correct,
If
or
you start-
people starting to bend it and flex it. But understand the position of the compassionate hunter who dreads that position to be in. Yeah, it's going to be an expeditious dispatch, for me personally. So
Most of the time, like anytime I've found where there's something that is a rule like that or a law that's kind of like, man, it's too bad that it's so cut and dry or like black and white like that because there's all these situations, why couldn't they do that? I find myself getting less mad at the people who made the rule and more just mad at people in general because you're like, I'm mad at people in general that there's the fact that we have to have one of these.
Right.
Because if we didn't have it,
Right.
there would be idiots who abused it.
Yes.
Or if we had it and we tried to have all these stipulations as to like, or exceptions. There would still be dumb people who somehow bend the rules where they're like, oh, well, I thought that deer didn't look too good, so I finished it off for it at
Correct.
3 a.m. And it's kind
Yeah.
of like, people,
Good thing I
like,
brought my spotlight.
by the lights of my Buick LeSabre, there it was. So,
yeah, and it's like, oh man, like we don't help ourselves. Like
That's
the
actually-
humankind does not help ourselves in so many situations, and it's like, it's killer.
Yeah.
And a lot of times too, that the people who even made the law or the rule, even they're kind of like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
we wish we didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that's probably the case with every rule.
I was gonna say, maybe
Yeah.
that's all
Is,
laws.
I
right?
wish
Yep.
I didn't have to do this. I wish people would just get it.
Yep.
But alas.
and that brings up like trailing with dogs too. That's another thing where a lot of states have different laws on that for a number of different reasons. I know friends of mine in the South that they trail with dogs. So, an animal that is taken that has a poor visual blood trail to a hound is, well, that's no match. And
Right.
a good friend of mine just recovered a buck that he actually put a good shot on. Did not bleed well last week. Used a hound, found the dog legal. My home state of Minnesota, absolutely illegal.
To track with dogs.
Yes.
And why? I guess what would be the way that somebody could be doing something bad by training?
If you
I
were,
think they're assuming
guess,
that
are
you're gonna track with dogs before the shot.
Yeah.
Oh,
and that,
I
I think
get it.
is if
Yeah.
I had to guess the
And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking after, like, a person may be more inclined to take a poor shot, knowing like, hey, this isn't the best shot, or
I
I
got a
can't
dog.
see.
I've got
you know,
dogs
but I've
to
got a dog, and I'll
Fido
find
here
it
will
tomorrow.
track them down. Interesting.
yeah,
I don't know. That'd be maybe we should.
Right. And
ask
then there's
the Minnesota
and then there's
DNR about that.
and then at the same time, that there's all these people who have hounds, and most of them are just thinking like, I have hounds because I love dogs. I love
Yep.
training the dogs. I love having the dog with me on my hunt. They're like, they're not doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
But because some yahoo out there
Yeah.
was going to use in the incorrect way or in an inhumane way or unethical way, then, everybody's kind of screwed over.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the tricky part of trailing. Is sometimes it gets a little.
Yeah.
Those dogs are pretty. I've never been on. I've read about them, and probably could have used one a handful of times. But they're pretty interesting. From what I know, they can tell you via how they are acting or signaling to you, like, hey, we're gonna find this deer. Or sometimes they're like, call off the chase, like, we're not gonna find this deer.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
A little 5-month-old puppy the other day was out. We were out wandering around, and she got real perked up about something. Started kind of like doing her slow walk over. She ended up finding a dead deer.
No kidding.
That's wild.
Well,
man.
we were out walking. Actually, so we were out walking in a similar area that you guys were.
Yep.
It was right before the deer got picked up, so it was the same deer.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we were
But
just
still
out,
cool to see
out going around. All of a
Yeah.
sudden, boom,
Yep.
laser focus.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
That is very neat.
I
interesting.
didn't try and show her anything. I was just, there you have it though. Dogs, crazy. I think we covered a lot on difficult blood trails. Difficult blood trails equals also sometimes difficult conversations and things
Yeah.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
I know some wild stories out there.
it's one of those topics that, like, there's probably 100 more.
Yeah.
Oh,
thousands
geez,
of more things we could talk about,
We
'cause-
didn't get into the technique of following a
oh
blood
my
trail.
gosh, yeah,
and
that's
that.
right.
It's like
Even
pretty much got
scratching
a
the
whole,
surface.
Maybe
yeah.
a part 2 coming.
Well, and there's just so many variables, It's like, what was the weapon? What's the time of year? What's the temperature? Where do you think it was?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
And there's so many different takes on technique. Like, well, no, you got to work in circles, or
Yeah,
well,
do
no,
you circle? Do you
Man,
not
yeah.
circle? It's like, don't ever circle. You
And-
shouldn't do that.
Yeah, and so I think that you're going to get a lot of regional dialects, so to speak, on what is the appropriate means of effectively trailing. And I think a lot of it comes down to the hunter and his understanding or her understanding
I
of
think it does,
quarry
too.
and terrain. I treat chasing whitetails different depending on where I am, what kind of water or what kind of food or what kind of known bedding area is there. And like the guys at the hunting public said, think like a deer. And you got to kind of put yourself into that mindset too when you're tracking them after the shot, even before too. But that helps a lot.
We should put out this is the formal, is it a request? I don't even know what the word is for it. Listeners out there, though, if you want to hear a part 2 on this, maybe we'll dive into some more stuff. Why don't you follow up with us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. But we can dive in. How about for now, maybe? I know that there's a million things we could keep going into, but for now, we dive into last calls. See
Cool.
if we pick it up on a part 2 later.
Sounds good.
I think
that
it's a
work?
good idea. Yeah.
Can I have 3 last calls?
I was going to have 2 actually, so yeah, I think that's okay today. One would be, and maybe this will be part of what we could dovetail into in a part 2 as well, is going to be a question to Mr. Ryan Muckenhern. I was going to ask, so you mentioned bullets. You've switched from explosive bullets, apparently, to bullets that expand. I don't even know how to explain it, but I'm curious, just like as a quick last call version of this conversation, what kind of like a bullet do you look for in a hunting bullet?
I'm gonna back up just a touch. We're not talking explosive like exothermic reaction,
like
yeah, right.
Yeah,
we're talking
about like shattering,
thin jacketed, thin based bullets for rapid expansion. And I won't mention a brand specifically, but that style of bullet to a heavily bonded bullet. My hunting partners will often accuse me of over bulleting my game, and so now I shoot a lot of homogeneous copper bullets, like a single metal bullets what these new kind of non-toxic bullets are. They're very tough. Or I shoot a bullet with a partition style design or a mechanical bond in the bullet, so that I'm somewhat guaranteeing myself at least 60% weight retention. And in the case of a lot of the homogeneous metal bullets, you're getting 100% weight retention, or plus minus a few percentage points from that.
Can you say that in terms of people who just buy them in boxes of 20?
What Ryan's talking
Is
about
that like a
is
polymer tip?
Yeah, when he's talking about the bonded bullets, he's talking about the bond between the copper jacket and the lead inner core in the bullet.
Oh, okay.
Essentially, it's just a way of holding that bullet together
Gotcha.
into a more solid one-piece style.
So now to mention brands that are really good at doing this, Nosler's AccuBond, Nosler's Partition, Nosler's E-Tip bullet, which is a homogeneous metal bullet, which I really like, Hornady's GMX, which is a homogeneous bullet, their ELDX, their interlock and their interbond, and then I shoot a lot of Barnes bullets. That is actually my preferred big game bullet is the Barnes TTSX specifically.
Cool. I've used those AccuBonds quite a bit. That's been a good bullet. That GMX, that's what I shot that buck with this last year. Swift Scirocco. Yep,
that's a good bullet. One you don't hear a lot about. It's a good bullet.
Yeah.
But guaranteed to, there's no guarantees, predisposing you to the highest likelihood of being able to break bone and then continue through to break more bone, and then hopefully exit the animal. That's the best case scenario.
Okay.
And I guess my last call, if I can make it now,
sure,
would be before taking the shot, consider the consequences, and then examine the situation and examine the outcome from like the worst case scenario. When I hunt now, and I'll say this to just about anybody, I focus on breaking an animal down from like a mechanical standpoint. If I break both shoulders or at least one shoulder on a deer and then get into the vitals, it's not going to be able to run very far because I've taken away its ability to actually physically motivate. So I'm a shoulder shooter, and it's because of that deer that
with a gun, though you're talking.
Yeah,
about.
correct.
With
Yeah.
a gun.
Yeah.
With a gun. I'm a shoulder shooter with a gun because of that deer that I almost lost.
That surprises me though, with the potential for meat loss.
I would rather lose 2 pounds of grind than 80 pounds of animal and then let something go to waste.
Fair enough.
Very interesting. My second one, and my second one was we talked a lot about whitetail hunting, I think, here, because a lot of us are whitetail hunters and we're in Wisconsin, things like that. But I'd be curious. I don't know if Paul maybe for his last call could tell a sweet blood tracking Western hunting.
I can give you one that's a little bit
maybe
different.
guide Idaho hunting story.
Yeah, I think I've got a good one for you. When you brought this topic up, it occurred to me because it definitely does stick in my head as a really interesting blood trail. And it was I was guiding an elk hunter who also happened to have a bear tag at the same time, and we tagged out on an elk very early in the hunt, second day I think it was. And so after we took care of the elk, and then we were able to bear hunt, and we were stalking along a rocky spine of rock, and I spotted up ahead of us a very distinctive black thing laying under a tree about 200 yards ahead of us. Pulled the binos up, and it was obviously a big black bear all rolled up in a ball, and he was laying right down on the base of a big pine tree. So we fell off the backside of the spine of rock, crept up to him, got right up over him. Still couldn't tell which end of the bear was front or back. He was his nose was burrowed into his body, and he just looked like a great big ball of fur. And so I had the hunter get ready to shoot, pack down, rifle on it. Also, I mean, he was only about 100, maybe 100 yards away tops. and got him ready and whistled a couple times. Bear wouldn't get up. Finally grabbed a small rock, threw it, landed right near the bear. He jumped up on his feet, boom, the guy shot, and the bear immediately went barreling downhill. High speed, full speed going down through. Ooh. It was a pine forest. So it was all like pine needles and pine duff down it. And asked him how he felt the shot broke, and he thought it was good. As soon as the bear jumped, you could sort of see front to back. You could see the vitals, and in theory, he put it right through the lungs. Well, we started slowly following that track, and there was very little blood. And of course, with a bear, that's not untypical because you have big, long, thick fur. And we talked about a lot of times with rifle hunting, that blood trail is slow initially, and in a bear, that a lot of that blood can get soaked into that fur before it actually comes down and hits the ground. So followed it. Finally started getting little pin drops of blood, but very little, and probably went about a quarter of a mile, and it was down to nothing. Almost no blood at that point. And it finally got down to the point I was following the bear by foot scuffs in the pine needles. And one of the things you can do when you're tracking is you gain a sense of what an animal's stride is. That's how a lot of times if you run out of blood, you start going off a stride on the animal. And so eventually I was following this bear by where his paws were going down in the pine needles. But eventually he slowed down and he stopped running, and now he was walking. And now a bear on pine needles and no blood leaves very, very, very little to go on. And it got down to what Ryan was talking about. Now I was sort of following based on instinct about which way that bear probably went. What was like the path of least resistance? Was there a game trail that opened up that I thought he might have gone down? And it got down to the point, and now I'm literally crawling on hands and knees, going along very slowly, looking for any little scuff, trying to follow these trails. And I got into a big open area, and I was down to where I was just about ready to call it at that point. It was out. There was nothing. About to jump into the sort of the big circle pattern where you start cutting big, wide circles at further distances looking for something. And at the time as a guide, I was wearing a cowboy hat on, and I was down on my hands and knees, and I heard something just pluck, pluck, pluck on the top of my hat. And it took me like a second to kind of dawn and realize what it was. And I looked up, and the bear was 40 feet above me in a pine tree, and he was watching me under him, and he started fidgeting a little bit then and moving with me under him, and it shook just a few drops of blood off his fur, and it landed on my hat. And if that blood hadn't hit my hat, I would not have seen that bear in that tree. I literally would have got up at that point and started cutting big circles at great distances to find him. And so ultimately we got the bear, got the hunter down there. We shot him out of the tree, killed him, and had him. But true story. That very, very interesting blood trail.
So nice.
That is correct. Thank you so much.
You stole it. I also think I saw that in the movie Predator.
Yeah.
Wow.
Correct.
That's
Which Paul actually
crazy.
wrote and produced.
Yeah. A very nice
after this
movie in
story-
It
itself.
was about him.
Wow. Finding the bear in the needle stack.
Wow. With blood on your
is
hat. That is the most.
incredible.
That is the most.
A couple of drops.
That is the
a
most
couple of
cowboy
drops.
thing.
That is
Yeah. That's what you wear a cowboy
God.
hat
I was going to say,
for.
that
Yeah.
makes I may switch.
That's why you wear a hat.
I've been doing it wrong the whole time.
incredible. Well, awesome. Thanks.
God, I can't-
Yeah.
Anyway, it was a
Hey,
good
what do you
one.
got, Eric? You got a good
Yeah,
follow?
thanks.
Anything cool?
Nope, I cannot follow that up. The only thing, I'm set up for failure now. The only thing I would say is, like going back to, when you shoot a deer and you do, or whatever it is, any animal, and you have a bad experience where you're not able to recover it right away, there's little things you can do that might go a long ways. Like, for instance, I always think back to that one that I touched on earlier, the deer that went, about 2.5 miles. Had to give up at some point, right? You got to get back to your daily life. But if possible, if reasonably possible, for example, I could have easily after work gone out and just done a little 30-minute walk in those areas, look for crows, look for any kind of sign that might suggest that there's a dead animal there. I might have been the one that found that deer rather than having to rely on the fishermen who just, props to them to actually reach out to me and not take it for themselves. So there are little things that you can do, like looking for crows, just that extra effort that might be the difference in at least that closure for you, or that kind of, like we talked about, that's going to be something then that you think about for the rest of your hunting lifetime. You'll be you don't think about the ones that you successfully harvested, all stuff like that.
Yep.
What beats you up is the ones that you probably killed and that went to
Oh, they
waste.
hunt, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
terrible. So
Laying somewhere.
No, that's a good one. I'm gonna hit everybody with about 19 last calls just so I can try and somewhat compete with Paul's. Number one, even if you think you missed, trail that animal up. You might be surprised. I mean, even looking at Ryan's situation with the muzzleloader there, one of those things where like, man, this deer was so close. How could I have missed? I've looked around. I haven't found any blood. Number two with that one, trust your gut. In your heart, you knew that you'd hit that deer. You just needed to sort out exactly what had happened, and with some persistence, you found that blood trail and recovered that deer. Number two, and this is more rifle hunting, it's always good to have, that last reference of what happened. Oftentimes you have like a mental snapshot in your mind's eye, when that impact took place, whether it was arrow or a gun hit. But I had two situations, actually both blacktails, where the deer reacted upon impact, and the last thing I saw was actually, of course you got a rifle that's recoiling, but I would have swore the deer went, to the left. And so that's where I took my search, and actually, I'm like, what the heck, dude? I know I hit this deer. He went this way, and it actually had gone the exact opposite direction. And honestly, had I started just going the other way, very short blood trails, so...
Sometimes your mind plays tricks.
Sometimes your mind plays tricks on you.
Yeah.
Go slow.
Patience,
If you've got a tough blood trail or you think you got one ahead of you, go slow. If you're lucky and fortunate enough to have somebody with you, have them stay at that last blood until you find new blood. Probably we've all been guilty of it to some degree. You get anxious. You want to find that next blood. Be patient. Go slow. Flag it out. Carry flagging tape with you. Brightly covered flagging tape. Actually, I do two things now. I carry flagging tape, and I put my Onyx tracker on as soon as I start tracking, and those can tell you two very important things. The flagging tape is not only if you do need to come back the next day, it gives you like a for sure visual starting point, but you can sort out, Paul, you're talking about like, okay, well, what's this deer doing, or what's this bear doing? How is it using the terrain? And you can kind of look up right away if you've been flagging that blood trail up pretty consistently, or maybe even a vector that animal is taking. And then, of course, with the Onyx, you have it in the palm of your hand, everything that's happening, and you can look at the terrain that lies ahead as well.
Those pins on there, if tree is sub MOA, those pins are like 2 MOA dots. They kind of cover up a lot, and then when you're actually on the ground, you're kind of like, well, I'm underneath a big red pin, but I don't know which tree this is. It's covering up a lot of tree.
Totally. And I guess I'll finish with another quick story, even though I'm being a little bit long-winded with this one. It's just such an important topic. But I was hunting Nebraska with a guy. He had shot a buck. I think it was probably about a 300-yard shot. He actually hit it low and back. And actually, if you were just watching it, just the way the deer reacted, you're like, got him. And then the deer walked off slowly. With the optics, we were able to see the impact, kind of like, oh, okay, not the best shot, We got up. There was snow on the ground. We got up to where we knew the deer had been. There was multiple sets of tracks around, a lot of deer in the area, not finding any blood. And this is where, kind of goes back to going slow and looking for details. The two guys that I was with were just kind of like charging it. They're like trying to find this deer. And, and like I said, I'm guilty of not going slow enough, but I actually found where the deer had been bleeding very little. And Ryan was talking earlier about those drops, and those drops of blood were dropping straight down and melting tiny little silos into the snow where the blood actually wasn't visible on the surface of the snow. But until I brushed it away with my finger, I actually got down to where the blood had cooled and coagulated. And I'm talking very maybe the size of a standard number 2 pencil eraser head and even smaller. But by that, was able to ascertain, okay, the deer was standing there. This is his track. I found a couple other spots where he had bled like that. And then eventually, went up that ridge line, caught up with the deer. He was still standing and shot him.
Nice.
Yeah,
so
that's a good one.
Awesome. Good stuff. Wow, hey, that was our best last call around yet.
I think so.
That's all I got.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say about that.
I'm exhausted.
Yeah, I agree. Well, hey, how about that? We'll finish it out. And thanks, everybody, as always, for listening. Like we said, hit us up on at Vortex Nation Podcast on Instagram. On this, we have these kind of tiles, for each episode when it comes out. Let us know what you thought about it. Let us know if you want to hear maybe a part 2. We might dive into some more stuff. Until then, we'll finish it off on the classic bye.
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 Goodbye.
Bye.
All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation podcast. Leave us a review or comment down below. We want to hear what you have to say about the show, maybe what you like, maybe what you didn't like, so that way we can make these podcasts as good as they can be. You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'll be posting about each episode released, so that way you can go back, find these things, maybe grab a little nugget of information that you can take with you to the range, out in the field, or maybe to the kitchen if we're talking about some good food. So, again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.